very warm welcome to day 2 of the IIC's Washington DC TMF, kindly sponsored by Amazon. I'd like to give a particularly warm welcome to our members from around the world who are joining us outside of their normal working hours. As we know, we have attendees from over 25 countries and from as far afield as Mongolia. Welcome to you all. Our first session today is a fireside chat between Evelyn Remellet of the NTIA and Peter Fattelnig from the EU's delegation to the USA. I'm delighted that IIC trustee and Ambassador David Gross will be moderating this discussion, which will give us an excellent overview of key initiatives on both sides of the Atlantic. Welcome, David.
Well, thank you very much, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever the time zone you're in. Welcome to this discussion. It's early morning here in Washington, D.C., and I'm thrilled to have everyone join us. Let's get right to it. We're going to have the next 45 minutes or so to discuss major issues that are the focus of the U.S. administration, as well as the European Commission and the European Union. And we're going to explore areas in which there are changes being made, areas in which there can be further cooperation, and a little bit about what's going to happen over the next year or so. So let's get right to it. Evelyn, could you talk a little bit about the major issues that you, as the acting head of NTIA, part of the Department of Commerce and the President's Chief Advisor on Telecommunications Issues, what have you been focusing on, and what are you looking to be focusing on over the next little while?
Yes, absolutely. Good morning to you, David. Good morning to Peter, and good morning to everyone who has joined us this morning. Wonderful to be here. Thank you to IIC for having me. Happy to talk about NTIA and where we're headed, what we've been focused on. We've been just a little busy over at NTIA. So, you know, as we're moving towards and really already in this mode and phase of everything connected and getting everyone connected, NTIA is, of course, on the cutting edge of all of the underlying policy issues, as well as the spectrum and connectivity issues that impact keeping that digital environment open, vibrant, and secure. And so the last year, that has really been our focus. And we've done that in several ways, and I'll touch on just 3 priorities for us over the last year. The first being connectivity and broadband. I think many of us who have worked in the internet policy realm for over the last many years have known and know how important connecting every individual to the internet is, so that they can have that high-speed connectivity to do everything from telehealth to education to shopping. The pandemic, however, really brought to light for many how essential this technology is. And at NTIA, we've been laser focused over the last year in working to ensure that every American can gain access to high-speed internet. When the president took office last January, he noted one of his top goals and priorities was to get every American connected. With the recent passage of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which we call the IIJA, closing the digital divide for Americans is actually in our sights, which is so exciting. It's so exciting for the professionals at NTIA who've worked on this for years, and the opportunities that it can bring to the nation. So with the announcement of this $65 billion that will be invested in broadband, we are off and running to get this money out into the states and to the local communities who are our partners on this effort as soon as possible to see that connectivity. So Within the IIJA, there are actually 6 different grant programs. The largest is a $42 billion grant program that will connect the unserved and underserved in the states as a top priority, and the territories. We also have money within $48 billion, which is coming to NTIA to focus on digital equity. We'll be adding more tribal grants, a $2 billion add to tribal grants under the program, as well as some middle mile dollars, $1 billion there. So we are extremely excited. This investment will add on to grants that NTIA has already been working to get out to the states and territories. We have been working on a broadband infrastructure program with states, also a tribal grant program, and we've started to announce those grants on a rolling basis. And we just closed a Connecting Minority Communities grant program, also for broadband connectivity, on December 1st, and moving into the evaluation. So with the combination of these monies, in addition to other monies from the federal government, from the Treasury Department, Agriculture Department, that will be going into America to, again, get this connectivity and the digital divide finally closed, we will be focused there, again, laser next year to get this money out to the communities in a smart way. So in addition to the initiative there on connectivity, we are of course also very engaged on spectrum. NTIA is the federal spectrum manager. We're working very closely with our partner, the FCC, as well as our interagency partners to make sure that we are moving towards freeing up as much spectrum in the US as we can for advanced communication services to realize that future economy and digital environment that we want to see in the US and globally. We worked with our partners on the C-band auction, still doing some work there. The auction that we just had in the fall, which was very successful for some flexible use licenses, also in the 3 gigahertz band. We were working with our partners to move that forward. We were happy to see that. Next, we will move looking at the lower 3 gigahertz band, again, looking towards that 3 gigahertz band, freeing up as much mid-band spectrum as possible to really fuel these advanced services, while at the same time being sure to protect our essential services, national security, airspace, weather systems. We want to make sure that that's paramount as well. So we continue to move forward and are also launching a spectrum strategy so that we are more coordinated with our partners and the goals that we want to achieve here. The last issue that I'll touch on is just what we are doing on the security side and also competitiveness side to make sure that as we move into 5G, 6G, that environment is going to be competitive, secure, and resilient. So much of our society is going to ride on these future networks, from IoT to connected cars to drones. We want to make sure that these networks are secure and resilient as possible for so much of what we want to see the promise of those. And so we've been working hard to ensure that that future, that 5G environment that is here today and the advancements there it's an open environment, that we have vendor diversity, so we have resiliency. We just last week had a great meeting in Prague, although virtual at the last minute, unfortunately, but a great discussion with our partners, the Czech Republic, the UK, Australia, Japan, that joined us in launching principles for telecommunications vendor diversity. And again, showing the commitment to governments to work with industry in this industry-led effort to ensure that we have the most competitiveness security and diversity in these networks going forward possible. So let me pause there and pass it back over to you, David, but wonderful to talk about what we're working on.
Terrific. And before we go to Peter, which we'll do in just a moment, and there's so many things, Evelyn, that you touched on that we'll dive into because it's so rich. But let me just focus quickly with you on the extraordinary amount of money that is going now that's been allocated to broadband. You talked about the 42 billion plus additional monies and so forth. I mean, this is an extraordinary effort that the government is now doing, unprecedented really in terms of its scope and scale. Over what time period will these monies be spent, and what sort of outcome do you expect to see from this extraordinary effort?
Absolutely, great questions, and absolutely agree with you, David. This is a historical moment, unprecedented, and I will tell you at NTIA, everyone working on this views this responsibility as so paramount. And again, this once in a lifetime generational opportunity to finally get every American connected is just so important. We, in terms of timeline at NTIA with the passage of IIJA, we have 6 months, which takes us to May 16th to release a notice of funding opportunity to the states and territories. This is for the large, what we refer to as the BEAD program, which is the 42 billion that you referred to, which is focused on, again, connecting the unserved, and then states can move to look to also improve connectivity for their underserved under this program. So we need to get that out in 6 months. In the meantime, we are encouraging states to be working on their planning effort now. They really need to be connecting with their communities in the states to understand the need, to understand what their challenges are going to be forming those partnerships so that they are in a good place come May to be able to move forward when we're able to get planning dollars out to them to really increase the sophistication around that plan, to come back to NTIA. Once we receive broadband maps, which will give the look across the US of who's unserved and where the underserved are. When those maps are released, those will be used to allow states to release the grant money for them to move forward on their plans. But we need those maps first. We expect that to happen sometime next summer. We are very focused because the need is so acute, and we know that from the pandemic. We are very focused on getting these dollars into the states and to work, those investments working as soon as we possibly can, but we also are focused on doing this right, because again, this is a historical moment. We want to make sure the money is going to where we need it to go and that we're hitting that goal of connecting all Americans. That's when the money will get into the states. That's when we will start and begin. Next year in terms of moving forward on their plans. The digital equity is a little bit behind that time frame also next year. But you know, David, this will take time. We will get those dollars working. We will get the states starting to implement their plans. But in terms of that final goal of full connectivity, this is going to take years. And we know that because of how long it takes to do the builds and the planning and the sophistication that's required here, again, to reach every American.
Terrific. All right, Peter, you're up to bat, as we say here. I know you've had, and your colleagues in Brussels and around Europe have had an extraordinarily busy year. One might even say an exhausting year. And I know that next year is going to be busy, no matter what people say. It's going to be really, really busy, of course. Tell us a little bit about what's been going on that you think is of particular importance, and a little bit about what you see happening going forward.
Good morning, everybody, and many thanks for having me. I'm thrilled to be part of this fireside chat conversation, even if it's early morning here. Now, what keeps me awake here are sort of two lines, and I want to structure it around two chapters. The one is the reinvigorated EU-US relations. It is not a secret that the relations with this administration are just so much more intense. They're also starting to deliver different outcomes compared to the previous administration. And this is something which, of course, is a reason for work. It's the outcome of a lot of work, but it's also, as usual, the reward of good work is more work. So we are looking down a host, and I would say a very large number of EU-US dialogues. Now, this is good. This is good because the conversation is the first element to set a new direction for a transatlantic relationship. And we do this across all the topics, no matter whether this is climate, energy, security. And first and foremost, now it seems it's about tech and digital technology, as critical and emerging technologies are just sort of part of every conversation. Any sector I just mentioned before is permeated by those technologies. And therefore, this becomes something more central in our transatlantic conversation. That has led us to create a new forum for talking about trade and technology. It's the Trade and Technology Council, agreed back in June, and the first meeting of the principals took place 29th of September. I highly recommend colleagues who would like to know what this is about to have a quick look at the joint statement from 29th of September. It highlights quite well what is ongoing, what are desirable outcomes, and where this whole thing is heading. What is interesting on this Trade and Technology Council compared maybe to other dialogues is that it's not about just exchanging mutual grievances we may have with each other, which is sort of the normal form for many of these dialogues, but it's setting that aside and trying to build only a positive agenda. It's only looking into what are a number of perhaps even small but forward-looking items we can be doing together. This is it. Sort of in that sense, it's also best driving a bit of a new approach of talking to each other. There is no desire to change each other, but there's a high degree of alignment we have found in a number of areas, whether they are artificial intelligence, whether we talk about semiconductors, whether we talk about large parts of cybersecurity. We have actually the same objectives. We may get there on different paths, but that's fine, as long as we align on the landing spot we have there. The second point I wanted, and that's when you alluded that also next year will be busy, maybe, but I would also sort of bring now a more positive message to you, sort of an early Christmas gift for all of those who are wary of Brussels producing so much. Brussels also has a 5-year cycle, and not every year in that 5-year cycle is as productive as this year is. That was our year 2, which is usually the most productive year. And I'm very well aware that we all have been overwhelmed by just an endless string of legislative proposals coming out of Brussels: the Digital Governance Act, the Digital Services Act, Artificial Intelligence, the Digital Markets Act, the Electronic Identity, just to name a few of the highlights. And there is a dozen of others which are maybe not as well known. Now, the good news is for next year, there will be a lot less, as we are in this process moving on from having proposed them into enacting them into law and implementing them, which is actually at the end the hard work, making regulation work. So next year will be a much lighter year, and probably the only element I would like to anticipate here in this conversation, which people for sure will be interested in, is the European Chips Act. Like the United States has Chips Act now under approval, we would like to do sort of a similar initiative, strengthening our semiconductor industry. And it will be very interesting to see if we are able to work together on investing at the same time a lot of money in the same sector, and where we all know that this is a sector which will remain very global, and the value chains will be very global in that sector. I would like to leave it here and look forward to the question and conversation.
Terrific. Well, let me just pick up, Peter, if I may, on a couple of things that you just mentioned. One on semiconductors, which obviously has been a great focus on both sides of the Atlantic, particularly because of the shortages and the ripple effect that those shortages have had. It seems natural to have a much closer set of relationships, particularly since some of the key technologies with regard to semiconductors are produced by European companies, and lots of the new innovations about the semiconductors themselves are really US, are at the cutting edge. How do you see that working together? Is it primarily going to be driven by industry working together, or are there governmental initiatives that will really spur that on?
That's a very good question. I think ideally first, there's a realization on both sides of the Atlantic. We have realized there's no money available to achieve, there's no public money available to achieve the public objective. In the EU, we want to move from a 10% market share in terms of production to 20%. And here in the US, you're a bit more ambitious, no surprise. You're more ambitious and would like to move from 10% to 30% of production market share. Now, the CHIPS Act here in the US and also in Europe, the money will be barely moving the needle on those two figures. So we need to work with industry, and the main element also in terms of investment will have to be carried by industry, by investors, and we will use the public money only as a catalyst, as sparsely as possible, as efficient and effective as possible. Now, in doing so, and knowing that, it's quite obvious that maybe we should avoid in investing in the same thing. Maybe we should understand on who is investing on what. Are we looking just in advanced node investments, but then we may create overcapacity there and undercapacity in another sector? The semiconductor sector is quite volatile. We noted from history. At the same time, market growth is there, and we also think, but it's probably on average around 5% a year. So this is a manageable growth. So it will be difficult for us to invest well into this sector, as we are right now not entirely sure how it will be going, what the demand curve will look like for the different products in this sector. So coordinating investment roadmaps is first and foremost something we should be looking into. And this is not necessarily exchanging secrets, but this is just continue talking and trying to see how this could be working out. Many of the companies in this sector, at least the leading companies, are global companies. So they will talk to both sides of the government or both sides of the Atlantic. So it's quite natural that governments on both sides should also talk to each other.
Yeah. One last question on the semiconductor side. Taiwan, of course, has been a place where there's a tremendous amount of activity. Do you anticipate that they'll reach out, that the transatlantic partnerships and governments will reach out and include Taiwan, or because of the China sensitivities, it'll exclude Taiwan?
Well, Taiwan is certainly eligible. First, here in the US, it's eligible, and they have announced plans they have for Arizona. So that's quite obvious. The same is actually happening in Europe. So all these big companies are talking to my commissioner back home and saying, how do I fit in the plans you have in there? There's, of course, the question of public subsidies and how can we help them get off the ground with new fabs and new developments in Europe. Taiwan and TSMC are part of that, quite clear. So it's also a strategy this company is pursuing in diversifying across the planet their production and fabrication processes and value chain. So in that sense, yes, and actually has probably very little of a political objective. It's just an economic element. And we think that makes a lot of sense. True also for Japan, for instance, if you want to go across the region.
Terrific. Going back to the TTC discussion that you had and how it might be different, will that be a forum, but it's quite far-reaching and quite broad. Will you be using that forum as another way of coordinating for international meetings, such as the upcoming meetings at the ITU or at the UN, OECD, and the like? Or is it really primarily just on a bilateral set of relationships?
Mm-hmm. That's yet again a very good question. I think first, there's one working group which is dedicated to standards, technology standards policy. So certainly in that group, one objective is to coordinate the technology policy standardization setting among us. And that will include standardization for and how can we make sure that our both region remain quite leading regions in terms of setting the standards for these emerging technologies. And that also means putting people and bringing people into the right positions. So this is actually happening. Clearly, this is one of the elements in there. Now, very often, and then you bring a point on OECD, very often for an OECD agreement is preceded by a transatlantic agreement at the end of the day. Even if you bring a conversation in the OECD, the conversation gets much easier if, to a certain extent, Europe and America just get together and hash out a little bit where their landing spot is, and then bring that back into the OECD. So I think this TTC will help us also reinvigorate outcomes in other fora, like the OECD or many other fora where we are both part of. And that could go into the trade area and any other area. So I think it will have that effect.
Terrific. Evelyn, changing gears a little bit, one of the areas that you touched on was spectrum. And obviously spectrum has been for a good number of years, a high priority. The auctions that have taken place, you mentioned the C-band, for example, and the like. Do you anticipate new approaches for reallocating spectrum? NTIA as the key player on behalf of the federal use of spectrum. Obviously, that's always been a very sensitive set of issues, the reallocation from federal to commercial uses. Do you see, looking down the road, changes in the way that that process works, or will it be primarily similar to what we've done in the past and just try to work through and find additional spectrum that could be moved?
Yeah, thanks, David. That's a great question, and one that's on our minds quite a bit, of course, at NTIA. But first, let me also just, note Peter's discussion around the TTC. Just a note to say how much we've appreciated that partnership as we're moving forward on that. NTIA itself is actually leading co-leading one of the working groups within the TTC that's focused on security, diversity, and interoperability for ICT supply chains. And so again, we appreciate that partnership and think there are many good things to come from that. But pivoting to the spectrum area, at NTIA, we absolutely think that we need to modernize the way that we approach spectrum allocation. We know that spectrum is going to continue to be a scarce resource for us. And so we have to be smart and we have to really be innovative in the way that we do allocations going forward. And that is going to require sharing, and it's going to require us developing new and innovative ways to do that sharing. We've been pleased with the successes that we've seen with CBRS. We think more advancement, more innovation can happen for sharing, especially when you introduce things such as artificial intelligence and machine-based learning, that if you're able, CBRS is actually focused on sensing. If you can use, for instance, AI in a way that's more focused on scheduling, we think that there is quite a bit of potential there. And so at NTIA, we have something called the IIC initiative that we're working on as a future initiative to, again, advance and look at ways to do spectrum sharing better. We know that we absolutely need to optimize protecting our national security and, again, our aerospace and other mission essential functions for spectrum. We want to make sure that we are protecting those, that we have the spectrum that we need for those efforts, while again wanting to free up spectrum for commercial use as well, especially again because of that economy that we want to move towards with smart cities and so much more of our environment connected. So we are very focused on those changes, that modernization, as well as just looking at how we do coordination with our interagency and having the input of the private sector into the process as well. We are working hard on those relationships and how we do coordination, and we think that's going to be a critical piece of moving forward also.
Terrific. It's continuing to focus a little bit on spectrum. Peter, recognizing that spectrum is done often by the member states rather than through Brussels, but Brussels has become increasingly active in this area, I believe, and particularly we've got a WRC, a World Radio Communications Conference, coming up in 23, at least it's scheduled for 23. These days, you never know when conferences are going to be held or not. Are you looking to have Brussels do increased amounts of coordination amongst the member states on spectrum issues? And if so, how closely would you like to coordinate with the United States and other major partners?
Yeah. Now, I think to a certain extent, the answer is already in the question. Of course, Brussels is always looking for coordinating the member states. So I'm saying that a little cynical, tongue-in-cheek here, but it's sort of our mission in life, essentially. Now, on spectrum, certainly we actually have begun working with the member states, working through their plans and trying to see if we can come up with a coherent European strategy. Now, I don't think this will be anytime soon at the level where we could reach out to the United States and say, look, here are the issues, here's how we would like to address them, these are our positions. Certainly, everybody will see the value if you come in a larger group, and this is also what we would like to aim for. But I think it will be probably quite somewhere in the middle of next year when Brussels and the member states will see whether we have a mandate for negotiation. I wouldn't call it a negotiation, but a mandate for a conversation with the United States prior to the conference. So there is a bit of a political process we need to do after we have figured out what we want to do.
So shifting again a little bit, but focusing on Europe, Peter, you've got a number of major legislative initiatives going on that have gotten a lot of attention on both sides of the Atlantic and globally. When do you anticipate that those pieces of new legislation will be finalized? Will it be next year?
For some of the legislations, yes, it will be next year. Because if you look at the Digital Markets Act, we have received a position by the co-legislator, and the Brussels process is the Commission makes a proposal, and then the European Parliament and the member states agree on a position and adopt that. So they are the legislator, or they are the co-legislator. And we have received an opinion on that one in record time, in less than 6 months. We had an opinion from the member states and an opinion from the Parliament, which is now being reconciled in a reconciliation process. And that could be even early next year under the French presidency where this will be enacted. The Digital Services Act is a different thing. It's just short behind it. It will have a similar timeline. So still the French presidency is adamant of getting that adopted next year. And similar it will be for artificial intelligence. The Digital Governance Act is a little bit less controversial in that sense, so it may sort of slip through without much of an attention. And then there are other legislations which probably will take a bit more time, and we will not be able to do them in the first half, but that may then hopefully only slip into the second half of the next year. But let's not forget that also the legislative calendar in Europe, it's not just full of digital policy items. There's a whole host of climate-related regulations, which probably have a far more reaching impact on the economy and society in Europe. So they will also suck a lot of political energy over the next year in trying to shape them in the right form and get them through the legislative process. But for those three I have mentioned, we are very, very, I'm looking for the right word, hopeful is not even, we are quite confident maybe that we will get it through quickly.
Right, coming down the home stretch, as we say. That's terrific. Evelyn, we haven't had any ITU meetings in person at all, and even the virtual meetings have not been the major meetings. They've been postponed. This upcoming year, we have, depending on how you count, 3, 4 major meetings coming up, including the plenipotentiary towards the end of the year, when Doreen Bogdan, the U.S. candidate, is running for Secretary General. We've got some European candidates running for senior positions as well. We have a development conference. We have a standardization conference. NTIA, of course, is always one of the leaders in preparing for our ITU delegations and the conferences. What do you see coming up out of the ITU? Are you thinking that this is going to be a big year, or is this going to be a holding pattern year, putting to one side the election of Doreen?
Yes, and we were disappointed too that the December meetings had to be postponed. We were looking forward to seeing everyone there and celebrating, of course, Doreen and her campaign. This is something, Doreen's campaign, that the Department of Commerce is very energized about. The entire administration, we're working closely with the State Department on this as well. But, Doreen's candidacy, she has done a tremendous job at ITU and her work with the development sector. We're very energized about the potential for the first woman general there. It's and also just so inspired by Doreen's vision, really, which is so close to one we all share, which is for connectivity and making sure we still have a very vibrant communications infrastructure. And so we're just looking forward to that campaign, in addition to the meetings this year. We continue to see issues and encroachment that we're focused on there in terms of other partner nations and proposals that have been put forth across the various sectors. And so we are energized to keep working on those issues to make sure that the viewpoint of wanting to make sure that we have a vibrant internet governance, community and multi-stakeholder model that's at play, and developing internet governance policy, and then the ITU focusing on its mandate and its area, but things like new IP that we have seen introduced, really calling into question just that vibrant digital ecosystem that we have all worked together globally to build, continues to concern us. And so we are going to be very strong and stay very strong at the ITU, tracking all of the proposals. And we think that there will be active issues happening this year, if we can get some meetings in. But for the most part, we're very much looking forward to Plenipot and Doreen's campaign, and hope that we can have that one in person with all of our global partners.
Yes, inshallah, as they say in the Middle East. Peter, along the same lines, obviously the ITU and these major international meetings are extraordinarily important, and from Brussels' perspective, I know this has really been a substantial focus. Are you looking, is Brussels really looking to these international meetings to move the international dialogue forward in a material and different fashion, or do you use bilateral and regional discussions as the primary mechanism for advancing EU interests?
Now, first, I had the privilege of meeting Doreen a few weeks back when she was honored at the American University here in Washington, D.C., and I think she's a terrific candidate. So really, it's always, I guess, much easier if the candidate is just simply good. And I think we see here clearly such a case working. Now, when it comes to the approach to Europe, I think I may have limited insight, but what I do know is that it has not come up in the high-level conversations we have had with with our colleagues here in the United States. So when I travel with the commissioners here to a variety of meetings we have in DC and elsewhere in America, this is not right now a theme we are discussing. I gather from that we are just not ready for that sort of conversation, and I wouldn't be able to really comment on that any further. But if I could sort of pivot just a little bit into something which is very interesting, or which I sort of sense in your question. Today is the second day of the Summit of Democracy here, and really kudos to our American friends of having that pulled together. So it has a fantastic agenda. It's a great event. And there are more than 100 countries participating, and that's what sort of we call, I'm not sure, there's different language, like-minded countries which we think, fall into this concept of democracy. I know all of that is a fluid understanding. However, I think that's really important because the transatlantic conversation, how important it is, it's not the only one. And I think whatever we do will be seen by others. And I think we also need to show that openness of having that conversation with other parts of the country, essentially exactly the same line. I mean, whether you talk ITU, whether you talk standards, whether you talk technology, on how we think technology is used in democracies. So all of that we need also to have with the rest of the world, this conversation. And the US has been gearing up to that. So if I'm correct, there is a foreign digital policy here since 2019 already. So there are strategies for that. And I would like to use maybe this forum as well to announce that the European Union is looking into building a digital foreign policy, which we should unveil January, February timeframe. It follows on the heels of the global gateway communication, so our strategy of how we would like to reach out, particularly to Africa and the Indo-Pacific region. But now we would like to sort of have more detailed strategies, and one of them will be around digital, coming out very shortly. And I think these are really, there you will find those elements of how do we coordinate in making not just our transatlantic relationship a better one, but also that relationship with third countries better.
Well, that's very exciting, and that's very interesting news. And will that this digital initiative be primarily about connectivity, or will it be a free flow of information types of focus?
Yeah, I think it's going to be very comprehensive. So I have seen already some chapters of it. The table of contents is pretty stable at this stage. So first, you cannot talk about technology without talking about data. This is just the underpinning jet fuel of anything we are doing these days. So certainly it will be part of it. Certainly it will contain our vision of it. I mean, that's quite obvious, but we would like to present a package so that countries find something attractive in there. So no piecemeal approach. Countries can look at it and say, that kind of makes sense. So how can I be part of it? We are underpinning it with an investment program and the money, so that you have a sort of a value chain of delivering that to our partners around the world.
Well, I don't know how you think that next year isn't going to be as busy as this year if you have initiatives like that, because that will certainly be some real focus and some real excitement associated with that.
Yeah.
We only have a couple of minutes, and I almost hesitate to raise it, but I'm going to raise it anyway. ORAN has been much in news. When both of you touched on vendor diversity and related issues. How do you see ORAN evolving over the next year or so? Let's start in Europe, and then Evelyn, if you could end up in the US.
Thank you for that. I think the feeling in Europe about ORAN is that we are a little overwhelmed by the American focus on ORAN. There is a bit of, it seems to be too much to us. If you look at the security elements of networks, I think, at least in Europe, we seem to have found a way of dealing with that at a political and technical level. So there is the toolbox is being implemented. So this is sort of running. We have less worries about sort of technical security, as this is a technical matter and needs a technical solution and can be addressed. I do understand there's maybe an economic question related to that as well. So that we can address, but then that's maybe a question which is not just limited to ORAN. And if you talk about vendor diversity, I think there's also a feeling that there are many other parts of the 5G delivery chain which could benefit from more vendors. So we would agree and see that in a more broad thing, that maybe we should make the whole value chain more competitive, add new actors along all the way, because we know this is going to be, or we hope this is going to be, a super fast growing market, and will not be able to, and the current vendors will not be able to carry all of that. Maybe at the very top, sort of those who produce hardware will be a bit slower, but particularly the software value chain can grow exponentially very quickly. And this is where I think bringing in new vendors, can add wonders. We'll see what's happening there.
Terrific. Evelyn?
Thanks, David. So I know we just have a minute left, but I would just say, so we certainly see this as much broader than just a technical security issue. This is about resiliency. And as we go from 5G, even looking ahead to 6G, it's so important that we have that competitiveness, so that from a supply chain resiliency perspective, we know that we're going to have choice and know that we will have trusted suppliers in the marketplace that we can rely on as we build, again, these essential networks where the stakes for what is going to be riding on them is just so high. And so we want that richness, we want that competitiveness, we want innovation to be happening more quickly, where we don't have to wait 10 years. And having open architectures and things like ORAN will shorten those innovation cycles and allow us to have more transparency into the ecosystem and to avoid vendor lock-in. And so we're extremely excited about where industry is taking open architectures and things like ORAN.
Wow, you were able to get a lot in 1 minute. That's very impressive. Well, thank you both, Peter and Evelyn, for an extraordinary 45 minutes tour of the world on tech issues and so forth. Really extraordinary. Lynn, back to you.
Many thanks, David, and thank you to Peter and Evelyn.